Hey, did you know that when it comes to communication, the words that we speak only actually account for 7% of communication? The other 93%, well, you're going to have to listen to that here in today's podcast. I have a special guest today, Heather Sager, and we're going to talk about magnetic communication. Now, a little background on Heather. She helps entrepreneurs structure their ideas, clarify their message, and hone their speaking skills so they can deliver magnetic live presentations, videos, and workshops that grow their authority. She's spoken on stages around the world teaching 6 and 7 figure business owners how to grow their business using effective communication. She is the host of the top rated podcast, Finding Your It Factor. Before starting her company, she was an executive at a management firm in healthcare. Heather lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband, 2 sons, and furry child, Chompers. This is an amazing podcast. Make sure that you stay tuned. So the big question is, how do ambitious people like us, who grew up listening to the old advice of go to school, work hard for 40 years, and retire when you're old, create a life today that is meaningful, abundant, healthy, and brings joy, while also leading a life that is productive and full of achievement? That is the question, and this is the podcast that'll help give you the answers that you're searching for. My name is Del Denny, and welcome to the Upgrade Your Life podcast. Welcome to the Upgrade Your Life podcast. I have a special guest today. I have Heather Sager on here, and we're going to talk about being intentional with our communication. We'll go through some strategies here in just a second. But first off, Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dal. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm very excited for you to be on here. You have some unique talents and unique abilities. You help so many people become more intentional with their communication. But to take a step back a little bit, Heather, can you tell us, our listeners, a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I, by trade, am a speaking coach. Specifically, I work with online entrepreneurs, helping them use the power of speaking on stages, both the physical ones that we often see at those big personal development conferences, but also on stages like webinars or podcasts or video. And for me, I think sharing your message on a stage is the ultimate way that you can impact the lives of other people, but it's a really, really scary thing. So one of my favorite things is working with entrepreneurs and leaders, helping them navigate that internal fear that comes with speaking, but more importantly, how to package up their message in a way where they can come across in a more influential way. And for me, this is something that I love doing so much because it's a skill that I stumbled into. I am a former executive in healthcare. I worked for a management company for 10 years where I led doctors and teaching them how to become more effective with their teams and with their patients. And I found that your ability to articulate yourself had a huge correlation with your ability to persuade others to follow your systems or processes. So I fell in love with the art of speaking as part of a job, and then I ended up turning it into a full business.
Oh, that's fascinating. I feel the same way with speaking. I stumbled into it as well, and I've been a student of speaking for over 15 years, almost 20 years now, really. And I've realized that you have to be so intentional about your communication. You can't just wing it. You can't get up on stage and wing it. And there's certain areas in communication that we work on, being, not only just the words that we say, but our tonality and our body language. And so that's why I wanted to bring you on here. Can you help us? Not many of our listeners are up on stage, but how can we become more intentional in maybe those 3 areas right there?
Yeah, I think, well, first off on that, just that comment around not many of the listeners might be on stages. I want to just like dissolve this thought, like right out of the gate, because there might be a tendency to go like, oh man, this episode maybe isn't for me today because I'm not a quote unquote speaker, nor do I have a desire to get on a big stage. So first and foremost, like we're all speakers. We talk to people every single day, but for some reason, when we slap a formal label on it and put a stage under us or put ourselves on camera, we get a little fuddy-duddy and think like, oh,
Hmm.
that's not for me. I don't want ever want to do that again. But then we talk to people every single day in our businesses and our lives. So what I like to encourage people to think about is when you start considering yourself as a speaker, even if you don't step on a quote unquote stage, you start looking at how you engage other people with a little bit more intention. And that's what we're going to talk about today is how do we become more intentional? Because when we think about So the concept of personal development, you and I were chatting about this before we hit record. I think so often in personal development, we do all these activities where we sit down and come up with our vision for our future. We think about who we are, who we want to be in 10 years, how we want to show up, what kind of cars we want to drive, houses we want to drive, businesses or careers. We think about all those dreaming things, and then we start putting goals in place. But I think a big misstep that many of us take is the skills that we start learning to help us get to that picture we've created for ourselves. Oftentimes those skills don't include the one that we do every single day, which is using our voice.
Mm.
And our voice, how we communicate with our customers, with our partners, with our kids, with our audience, whoever it is we talk to, those conversations are how other people perceive us. And that perception really is your personal brand. So I like to start the conversation with, how do you get more clear around who you are and how you want to show up, so that way you can start being more intentional with how you communicate. And we'll talk about some specific tips around how you can elevate your communication. But I think first and foremost, you have to get clear around how you want others to perceive you.
I think that's an excellent way of looking at it, because you're absolutely right. We're not everybody's on stage, but it is so important to realize that communication is important. We have to communicate our idea. As we're living in this, our environment has changed, where a lot has gone on to Zoom meetings and go to webinar, and that's a platform to speak as well. And how do we show up on that? How are we intentional with that? So what are some tips that we can have to help us communicate better and be a little sharper in our communication?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. I love the fact that you brought up Zoom or GoToMeeting, like any of these technology tools. So many people who aren't used to speaking virtually are now having to do it, even if it's just piping up in a meeting. So a couple things to consider. When we communicate, we have to recognize that we are telling people more than just our words. So in fact, when it comes to communication, there are three parts. And let's put a visual to this. Imagine a classic pie chart. So you have a pie chart in front of you, and it's broken up into three slices. The slices are the words that you say, it's how you say those words, and then everything you say without opening up your mouth. So all of your body language, your facial expressions, your posture, your eyebrow raise, the roll of your eyes, any of those things, we're communicating all the time. So the thing that I think mistake is, so many of us focus on the words we use. We try to get the right words. And if you think about this, if you've ever written an email before, imagine you're trying to write a difficult email where you're giving someone feedback. I mean, how many times do you come to your desk, you sit down for 90 minutes, you write the email, you then put it on a back window, you move on to another task and come back to it, and it takes you an entire day to write an email because you're trying to say it in the perfect way.
Hmm.
Well, it's because you've lost the context of the message. And so you're trying to put all the emphasis in the words. So in what I call the communication pie, the three parts, the pieces aren't equal. The words that you say are only 7% of the pie. 7% of the pie of what you say is your words. 38% is how you say those words. So your tone, your pace, your pitch. And then 55% of your message is your body language. And this pie was done from a study in Southern California at a university back in the 70s. And it was around communicating with things that had an emotional attachment. But what I found in business, especially in marketing, we're always tapping into some kind of emotional response from people. So I've found that the communication pie holds true, which means whether you're talking to someone in person, but more especially on virtual, like on a Zoom, putting your camera on, you're able to show up in a much better way and actually communicate with your body language, which is, as I mentioned, more than half the equation.
Absolutely. And I think so think about this. Just like you said, 93% of communication is not our words. So the tonality and the body language, and in those emails, 93% of communications gets lost because we have that 7%. How many times have we read an email and we didn't know how to take it because there's no tonality behind it?
Yes. Or we put our own tonality into it when it has
Ah.
nothing to do with that other person.
Exactly. You might be putting some anger in that tonality, and the person, it was a kind email, or vice versa. And so we have to be careful with it. And I love that with Zoom is now we're incorporating tonality, we're incorporating our body language in the camera. So when we show up, on camera and our webcams and all that good stuff, how do we become even sharper with our tonality and with our body language?
Yeah, so there's a couple things, there's some basics, I would say, when it comes to the camera that you want to have in place. Some of these might feel super basic if you're listening. Some might be, I mean, this big monumental idea, but let me hit you with a couple of things. So first and foremost, know where your camera is and look into the camera when you're speaking. Now, the tendency that most of us have, whether we're using our computer or our phone, is we stare where we see our face, or maybe we look at the other people in the room because we're trying to see what their reaction is. But the thing that you have to remember is virtually eye contact still matters. And when it comes to virtual speaking or virtual meetings, you have to remember, we all recognize there's so many distractions. There's our kids running around in the background. There's other internet browsers. There's all these other distractions. So the power of eye contact is extremely powerful, but you have to be cognizant that it feels a little different when you're the one giving the eye contact because you can't see the other person because you're looking into the lens. So one thing I would say is find the lens of your camera and start getting comfortable speaking directly into it. Just when you're speaking, you can move back to the screen and you can even pop back and forth a bit. A good rule of thumb that I learned by one of my body language mentors, Tanya Ryman, she said that a good rule of thumb for eye contact in everyday conversation, and I use this on camera too, is about 70% of the time you should be using strong eye contact. And that doesn't mean you have to stare into someone's soul. You can look at their eyebrows, the bridge of their nose, like places that are around their eye, but about 70% of the time you should maintain that. I find the same is really true with camera because when you're on the receiving end of somebody speaking on video and it feels like they're looking directly at you, you're much more likely to stay present on that video versus going over to Nordstrom's to figure out what's on the latest anniversary sale. So
Mm.
I think eye contact is number one. Number two, I would say watch the height of your camera and make sure that it's at a flattering angle. So we've all been in those meetings where somebody has their laptop down on a desk and their chair is higher and it's like shot up their nose.
Mm-hmm.
Don't do that. You don't look great at that, and other people don't really want to see that. So I always like to say keep the camera at about eye level, maybe slightly higher. Like my camera in my office right now where I'm sitting, my camera is sitting right on top of, let's see, it's maybe about an inch higher than eye level. So I think that it's a flattering angle. It also allows you to just look at people a little bit more comfortably, and then you don't feel like you're looking down on anyone. Nobody likes to feel like somebody's looking down on them. So I think camera height is important.
Heather, I completely agree. I've been on so many video conferences lately where there might be 50 people on there, and then you start looking at all the views of people on there, and I'd probably say 3/4 of them have very unflattering angles, and you almost get distracted from the presenter's message because you're looking at all these different camera angles. So what else can we do to be better when we're on screen?
That it's interesting that you say that because that gets me thinking about one thing that we have to remember when we're on camera, but also just in everyday conversations or in meetings is what does our listening face look like? I think that is more telling at times than our speaking face. I think we think about, making sure that we're coming across empathetic or that we're coming across as excited or whatever the tone we're going for. But I don't think we pay a lot of attention to our listening face. And right now, right to your point, paying attention to that, you actually can see yourself on camera. It's a little scary to think about, but this is a great time to practice just that.
Very much so. So going back into the realms of talking about the pie chart, what other advice would you have for us when it comes to our words, our tonality, our body language?
Yeah, so a couple things that we can do right out of the gate to make small incremental changes, but will have a bigger impact on how we come across to other people. So if you think about, we want to come across more confident. Okay, so think about your body language. So when you're in a meeting and you're listening to someone else and it's your turn to give your idea, think about what your body language is doing. So number one, you know this, but I want you to think through how this comes out in a moment. Take a deep breath, shoulders back, making sure that your arms are not crossed in front of you. I also recommend not having your legs crossed in front of you. The closed off nature makes us come across as a little bit more meek and defensive. If you want to come across confident, you want to come across strong, which is a little bit more of a masculine stance. You want open body language, like open chest, your shoulders back, and you want to make sure that you leave your neck a little bit more loose and relaxed. Excuse me, let me say that again. You leave your neck a little bit more loose and relaxed. What happens is when we start getting nervous, we carry a lot of tension and strain in our neck, which makes our voice go a little bit higher. That does not resemble confidence to whoever you're speaking to. So what you want to practice is, okay, let's say you're going to speak up in a meeting and you have a really controversial idea or opinion that goes against the grain. You need to take a second to yourself right before you speak and go, okay, confidence. Take a deep breath, shoulders back, and just make sure that you're not carrying tension in your throat, in your neck, so that your voice comes across in a strong, confident way. So I would think about that. And a couple things that you might want to consider when it comes to your voice itself. We've heard phrases before around make sure that when you deliver something, it sounds good. But what does that mean? Let me break down for you. I say there's 5 specific things that you want to focus on when it comes to your vocals. And these are all things that we can practice. And let me just hit you with them real quick. So when it comes to your vocals, I call them the 5 P's of vocal delivery. And they are pace, so how quickly you speak, the pace of your words, your pitch, so that would be like your tone. So do you have a high pitch, low pitch, and more importantly, do you have a variation in your tone when you speak? Number 3 would be power, which I say is volume. So are you talking too loudly for an intimate situation, or are you coming across as timid or unconfident by speaking too quietly? The 4th is pause, meaning taking those strategic pauses when you're delivering information and not just filling it up with just more ideas or filling it up with filler words. And then 5 is passion. And that's all about believability, because if you're excited about what you're talking about and you clearly believe in what you have to say, that passion becomes infectious and other people get excited about it too. So pitch, pace, power, pause, and passion. It's a heck of a lot of P's. Those are the things I would start thinking about when you say, how can I deliver this message in a more compelling way? Practice those things. And the way that I like to put it into practice is, there's a lot of P's happening in this whole topic right here. But how I like to do it is, if you have little kids at home, you most likely read bedtime stories.
Mm-hmm.
I practice this for years. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old at home, and we do story time every night. I get really into the characters when I read books. So it's not really for them, even though they like it. I use this, think about it as like vocal exercises to get my voice in a much more dynamic way of delivering. So that way, when I show up on a phone call like this, just pay attention to how I speak. You notice how it's not monotone. I'm not keeping this even keel across the board. I know that the only way I have to connect with the audience right now is through my voice, my words, but more importantly, how I deliver those words. So just even that sentence, notice how I put a pace to it where it made more sense. You feel that? So those are things that people don't practice, but hey, you can learn how to do them just by putting a little bit of intention behind it.
I think that is a great way to practice right there. That is a great ninja skill for all of us to learn is how do we practice our vocals? Well, read a book to your children. That really is a great way to practice that pitch, the pace, the volume, the pause, the passion. I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
And that's something that I am very cognizant of, and that's my lacking where I need to improve. I know when I'm up on stage, there's times where I'm very, very passionate, but then my pitch is too high and I'm talking really high and when you talk too high, you sound a little too nervous and you don't sound very confident. And that's something I've also worked on is lowering the volume, lowering the pitch a little bit, and being more confident. What else can we do to be sharper in our communication?
So body language is a big one. So I like to talk to people about practicing for a stage performance. So the big keynote. And it's not because I think, well, I do think that everybody has a keynote presentation in them, but I realize that not everybody is going to want to go down that route. But I encourage my students and customers to create a quote unquote keynote presentation. I call it a signature talk, because I think that if you train for a marathon, it's no sweat to run a 5K in any given day. I'm a runner. There's a running analogy for you. So what I mean by that is I think you have to envision yourself on a stage, and you can put into practice some other things. The example I'll give you right now is, let's say body language is something that you want to work on. You want, let's say, other people to see you as somebody who is an authority, somebody who is well articulated, somebody who is confident, who is bold, who's a leader that others will follow. Well, you have to make sure that your body language mirrors that. So number one, pay attention to what you observe by other leaders that you admire. If there are influencers in the personal development space that you admire, if there are leaders in your industry, pay attention to how they communicate. How do they show up on camera? Do they show up on camera? How do they show up when they speak on stage? If you have people in your office that you're just drawn to, what is it? Can you put your finger on to what it is you're drawn to? So I always say, take note in real life with what you see, because you can start adopting some of the tips and techniques that they use just by noticing. So maybe one of those things is, let's say, mirroring. So the idea of following what somebody else is doing it and doing it back to them. So let's say you're in a one-on-one conversation with a member of your team, and you're trying to have, let's say, a conversation around a difficult topic, around a performance review. If your employee is feeling really, really closed off, and you can tell their shoulders are slumped, their arms are crossed, what you want to start doing is trying to get them to open up a bit. You don't do that by doing everything that they're doing, but you can do some mirroring. So if you notice that they have their arms crossed in front of them, you might try gently putting one arm in front of you on the desk as you're speaking to them. But see what you can do to mirror their words back, like maybe just saying a few words that they're saying by paraphrasing things back to them. What you can do is start mirroring what they're doing, but also adding in your own, a little bit of openness. Like if you start uncrossing your arms, you'll notice that the more you talk, the more likely that they'll start mirroring you. So the art of mirroring, it's a really kind of very specific example, but it's a really powerful way to get other people to, I like to use it when I do networking events. If you want to establish really good rapport from somebody out of the gate, if you join somebody at a cocktail party and they're holding a drink in their hand and the other hand's in their pocket, if you mirror that body language back to them, you'll notice like you guys will connect a little bit more, and they'll be like, huh, there's something about that person I like, but I can't put my finger on. So I think mirroring is great.
That is such a golden strategy that I use as well. And I learned that years ago. Is the whole premise behind it is people like people that are like themselves. So if imagine if, the listeners of this podcast are all over the world, but let's just say we're here in North America, we're in the United States. And let's say we traveled to another country. We went to Australia, for example, and we were on a tour and everyone was Chinese, Japanese, French, and then we found that one American on the bus. We'd probably be drawn to that one person because we have something in common with each other and we talk more. But if we're in the United States, we probably want to talk to each other. But because we have that uniqueness together, that's what mirroring is. When we're in a networking event, when we're in a business meeting and we start mirroring the patterns of the people, like you said, there's something about this person I really like. Well, it's because we're matching the same way.
Yeah. And something to hit, because sometimes when we're having this conversation, I hear someone either in the back of my mind, it's just a little gut reaction, or I've actually heard this thing before is, oh, that's kind of schmucky. Like, I don't want to trick people into liking me. And so I want to hit on that real quick, because if you're like, oh, I don't want to use a tactic, it sounds sleazy. So what you want to do is I like to reframe it and think, my job when I communicate with other people, let's say I'm at a cocktail hour, or let's say that I'm hosting an event or whatever it is, right? I think about, first of all, I hate like networking. I hate small talk. Like I get social anxiety at those kinds of events, which is very ironic because I speak to people for a living, but it's very draining to me. So I like to reframe how I go into those situations. Instead of focusing on me, I go, I bet you the majority of the people in this room feel the same way. So how can I make them more comfortable? And that's my competitive advantage when I go into new social situations. I hate new social situations. I hate small talk, but I like people. And I don't want other people who maybe have that same disdain for those networking events. I don't want them feeling terrible. So why not see what I can do to make them feel a little bit more comfortable? And if me joining them in conversation and slightly mirroring their body language puts them at ease, I'm going to call that a win. I don't think that's schmucky at all. I actually think it's a really nice gesture because you're opening somebody up to a conversation that they may have been a little terrified about.
You know, you're absolutely right. There's a few thought processes that we can have about that, because these are tactics, these are strategies, and you can use tactics and strategies for good and for bad. You know, I think about cells. You know, cells can be a good thing, but there's also that idea of coercion, right? There's coercion where it's a one-way transaction, or there's persuasion, which is usually a two-way transaction where both parties benefit. So communication really involves a lot with persuasion too. Can you talk a little bit about persuasion for us?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because when you look up the definition of persuasion, I think it even includes the idea of coercion. Like I I like here's how I like to think about it. I always forget what these are called. I'm not a sciencey person. So those charts that we all see. It's like a line graph that's got it's a bell curve. That's what it's called. A
Yeah.
bell curve that we see a lot of times in studies. And there's a very common bell curve that comes when we talk about the adoption of technology. So let's pretend the new iPhone's coming out. You always have the people on the front end that are the early adopters, the people who are like, oh, I'm already on the wait list. I've already pre-purchased. I'm going to get whatever the new techie thing that Apple's throwing out. I'm in. Then you have the people that are the absolute opposite, who still have a flip phone. They're the absolute people that are like, I don't need it whatsoever. And you're never going to sell them whatever the newest product phone is. And then you have this bell curve of all the people in the middle. Some people who are just like, I'm just waiting for it to come out to see the reviews. Then you have people go like, I don't need one right now, but in a couple years, I'll probably get around to that, the laggards. So thinking about new technology, you have the people on the train and the people who will never get on the train, and then everybody in between. I like to think about this as the same way when you're dealing with an audience or speaking with a group of people. When it comes to persuasion, your job is not to get everybody on the train. You can only persuade people who have an interest in what you're talking about. So you're speaking to them. You're not trying to convince the people who are never going to get a brand new iPhone. You're not trying to, like, why would you waste your energy trying to go there? So persuasion isn't about trying to completely move people towards something that they don't want, don't need. Persuasion is speaking to people who already have an interest, but they're just not quite sure it's the right timing for them. So you speak to them in a way that connects with their potential concerns, speaks to their potential priorities, their interests, their desires. That's what persuasion is about. When you speak to those things, then you allow people to make their own decision.
I love that. So how can we be better persuaders then when we use communication and we want to persuade? So what's some tips that we can use there?
This is an excellent, excellent question. And I think this is a very easy way to approach this, which just goes against everything that we want to do, is we have to be committed to the outcome of whoever the person is in front of us, that whatever choice they make is the right choice. And their choice might not be our recommendation.
Mm.
That you have to release yourself from the outcome being your way. And I think, let me give you an example of this. I do sales calls. So I do private one-on-one coaching with a handful of clients every quarter. And I do sales calls every single week. And when I jump on sales calls, I don't go in with the expectation that, I'm going to book this person. Because I don't want to book every person I talk to, because I know I'm not the right fit for everyone. And also, we've all had those clients and customers that are absolutely draining because we were desperate for a sale and we connected with someone who wasn't the right fit. So for me, what I focus on is, how do I use persuasion by having a conversation and asking someone questions so that I can get to know them more, but also they get to know me, so we can both self-filter and determine whether or not this is a good match. And I think that's a really powerful way that we need to be looking at sales and just looking at persuasion in general is you don't know the best answer, even if you think you do. Because at the end of the day, you don't know the realities of someone's entire world. You don't know the full story. And to presume that you know what's best for someone else is just, I mean, that's highly egotistical. So if you free yourself from that and say, you know what, I have a freaking good solution. I have a really great thing that I feel really, really excited about. And I know it works for a lot of people, but I'm also humble enough to recognize that it might not be the best fit for everyone. And the point of a discussion, the point of a presentation, the point of a sales call is for us to have a conversation to determine what's best for both of us. And that for me has been hands down the best tactic that I've used, the best tip that I use with my clients is freeing yourself from the outcome and embracing the art of getting to know people and helping them decide the best decision for them. But with all of the right information, that's your job, is to make sure they have the right information to make a good decision.
I think that's a fantastic advice. And too many people are so attached with the outcome, which really leads us up for disappointment. I mean, that's just not a sales strategy, but just it's actually a Buddhist strategy about disconnecting from attachment and just kind of going with the flow. Now, I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
I ask every single one of our guests this question, and it's a reflection question, and it goes like this. If you could turn back time and talk to your 18-year-old self, what advice would you give yourself for reaching your full potential?
So I'm going to go a little deep for a moment, which is maybe not what you were expecting on the answer to this question. But for me,
bring it on.
I have every one of us has a unique life, right? We're all uniquely experienced for where we came from to get us to where we are right now. And for me, being 18 was a very, very significant time in my life. So 5 days before my 18th birthday, my mom died of breast cancer. Mm. And so I walked into a newly found life as an adult without a mom and just trying to figure out what the hell just happened. And for me, a series of events happened coming out of that time period that completely transformed my life. Many of them having to do with speaking up and getting more comfortable with audiences. If I had to go back and tell my 18-year-old self something, is this idea that life is going to throw a lot of crap your way. And clearly you're strong. Clearly you're in it. Like you're doing okay. You're going to survive this. But if you lean into these really horrendous moments in life and you live through them and you take what you learn to other people to help them, your life will make a difference. Your life will have an impact. And I knew that at the time, but I didn't really know that until within the last 5-10 years around how sharing your own personal story, sharing your own vulnerability, sharing the things that you've gone through, how much it connects you to other people. I wish at 18 I would have seen that and I wouldn't have resisted so much of dealing with the pain that I really needed to in that moment.
That's great advice. Speaking of connection, how can people connect with you? You've had some really tactical strategies here. So if people wanted to reach out to you, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, I love tactics. I also just love the whole idea of personal development. I feel like when you work on yourself, you show up better for other people through your words and your message. So the favorite place that I love hanging out is on Instagram. So you can come connect with me over at the Heather Sager and just shoot me a DM. I'd love to hear what your top thing was from the show today. I'd love to chat with you. But where most of my audience connects with me every single week is over on my podcast, which is called Finding Your It Factor. And every week we're showing up teaching the audience how to become more magnetic using their voice on stages and off.
Fantastic. I definitely want to recommend everyone subscribe to her podcast. I've learned so much from this. Being a speaker of 15 years, I've learned a lot on this episode here. So Heather, thank you for coming to the Upgrade Your Life podcast.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.